Next, from the Union League Club of Chicago. On the 150th anniversary of the inauguration of President Abraham Lincoln, Dr. David Zarefsky analyzes the specific words and phrases used by President Lincoln in his first inaugural address. That address, delivered on March 4, 1861, came as the nation was on the brink of civil war, and President Lincoln tried to assure the Southern states that his presidency was no reason for them to leave the Union. This runs about 55 minutes.
It's always a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to share the podium this morning with the other members who will be speaking. I suspect there will inevitably be some overlap in some of the things that we have to say. That doesn't bother me because I'm in the unusual position of speaking early in the program rather than, as often happens, in alphabetical order. Lincoln, I think, is the only president whose second inaugural is more well known than his first. We all remember some of the great phrases in the second inaugural. His elegant account of the coming of the war. Both parties deprecated war, but one would make war rather than allow the Union to survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. We remember his scriptural, theological account of the war. And of course, we remember the peroration with malice toward none, with charity for all. It takes nothing away from the majesty of the second inaugural for me to say that Lincoln's first inaugural address, the one that he delivered 150 years ago today, is also worthy of our careful attention. Unlike the second inaugural, it was not quite so brief. The second inaugural is a mere 700 words. The first inaugural took 35 minutes to deliver. Lincoln spent almost as much time giving the speech as we'll spend today talking about it. He spoke before an audience that was estimated at 25 to 30,000, so each of you is standing in for about 150 people who were in Washington to hear Lincoln speak 150 years ago. It was, to say the least, not an average presidential transition. 4 months had passed since his election, during which, as you've heard, Lincoln was quiet. He was quiet, first of all, because that was the tradition. Second, because he said his views were widely known already, and for him to repeat them would somehow suggest weakness. And he was quiet because of fear of misinterpretation of anything that he might say. While he was quiet, 7 southern states, beginning with South Carolina in December of 1860, and culminating with Texas at the beginning of February 1861, had passed ordinances of secession. There was considerable debate and disagreement in the North about how to respond to this secession crisis. There were some who said, "Good riddance, let them go." There were others who said, "This is an illegal act. They must be coerced militarily into abandoning it." And there were some who sought to find a last-ditch compromise, and we've heard about some of those compromise efforts. James Buchanan, the sitting president, had failed to act. He had said that while he sympathized with the causes that had prompted secession, secession was clearly illegal, but that he had no presidential power to do anything about it. While Lincoln was quiet, his silence had created a rhetorical vacuum that others tried to fill, either Lincoln's allies claiming to speak about what he would do, or extreme Southerners voicing fears about what he would do. He had given a series of brief speeches from the train on his way from Springfield to Washington. Those had offered sometimes vague hints, sometimes misleading hints about what he might do. The best way to think of them, perhaps, is as trial balloons that Lincoln was floating at different points along the way. Lincoln came to the podium in front of the Capitol to deliver his address before having been sworn in. That was the custom at the time. You had to work for your supper before you took the oath of office. But he stepped forward to the podium in the face of threats on his life. The speech that he delivered, the first inaugural address, was actually written over the course of about 6 weeks, finished in Springfield in late January of 1861. Lincoln had it printed, and he sent copies to various people for their comments. Most had no or very brief comments. His friend in the Illinois Republican Party, Orville Browning, suggested one very significant change that I want to talk with you about later. William Henry Seward took seriously the invitation to comment on the speech and suggested 33 changes to the text, 19 of which Lincoln adopted. 8 he adopted with modifications, and he discarded 6 of them altogether. And Lincoln himself made 16 changes to his own text after he had written it and circulated. The text was brought to Washington by Robert Todd Lincoln, his son. Abraham Lincoln said, take care of this and make sure it's there. And there's a famous story about how Robert Todd Lincoln put it in a valise which he left at the desk at the hotel. And fortunately, it was able to be retrieved. Aside from filling the expectations of an inaugural address, what was Lincoln trying to achieve in this speech? The answer that is usually given is that he was trying to conciliate the South. And indeed, if one reads the speech, one notes there is a generous and conciliatory tone to it. But I think we need to look more closely at this matter of conciliation and ask who exactly was Lincoln trying to conciliate, because we may decide that that is not, after all, the primary purpose of the speech. He is certainly not trying to conciliate the leaders who have passed and supported those ordinances of secession in 7 of the states. In fact, he says specifically in the speech, not in one of the excerpts that I've reproduced for you, he says that there are persons in one section or another who seek to destroy the Union at all events and are glad of any pretext to do it, I will neither affirm nor deny, but if there be such, I need address no word to them. So it's pretty clear that he is not trying to conciliate the leaders of the rebellion in the 7 states that have seceded. He may have been trying to appeal to public opinion in those same states, because one of the mistakes that Lincoln made was to believe that in all of those 7 states, except possibly South Carolina, a majority of the people was really in favor of the Union, and their views had been hijacked by leaders who took over the state governments and passed these ordinances of secession. So he may have been trying to appeal to them, although that's not so clear. If anything, the strongest case can be made, I think, that he is trying to conciliate the people in the 8 slaveholding states that have not seceded from the Union, in order to hold them in the Union, to blunt the momentum of secession, and particularly to hold on to Virginia and Maryland, without whom he was not sure that he had the military force to defend the capital. I emphasize that this purpose to the speech may have been overplayed because one common evaluation of the address is to say, Lincoln sought to conciliate the South. The South was not conciliated. Therefore, Lincoln's speech didn't accomplish its purpose. And some people would then say, well, but he really couldn't have, and others will say, therefore, the speech was a failure. It seems to me that at least as important as conciliating the South were 2 other purposes. One, to reassure Northern moderates that the new president was not a dangerous radical who would do anything rash, and even more important than that, to articulate and defend what the government's response to the crisis will be. And I'm going to suggest as we go through the text that we will see that the way in which he chose to articulate the government's response also served to define the nature of the crisis in a way that was very useful for Lincoln's purposes and ultimately for the purposes of the North. Now, one more thing before we turn to the text. It's worth thinking briefly about what's not in this speech that we might expect to be there. And I want to highlight three things that I bet if I were to ask you, you might think would be there, but aren't. First, there is no argument against slavery, either moral or otherwise. Lincoln does say in the speech, as he said in one of the letters that you just saw, one section of the country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, and the other believes that it is wrong and ought not to be extended. But he makes that statement simply as a factual assessment of where the two sides are. He does not argue that, in fact, slavery is wrong, much less why it is wrong. The speech does not take sides on the question of slavery. The second thing you might expect to find there, but won't, is any acknowledgement that 7 or any number of states have seceded from the Union. The closest Lincoln comes is early on in the speech. He says, a disruption of the federal union, heretofore only menaced, is now formidably attempted. In other words, Lincoln is characterizing the events that have taken place in the same way one would characterize riot or insurrection, with the goal of disrupting the Union. He does not acknowledge that any state has passed any ordinance attempting legally to take itself out of the Union. Indeed, he never will acknowledge that. He removed a line from an early draft of the speech saying that this disruption had been effected as far as could be done on paper. I suspect because he did not want to acknowledge even that. And this is an early window on Lincoln's view about what the nature of the crisis is that we will see when we get into the text. And third, something that's not there, that you might expect, is what Lincoln is going to do about the federal property that has been seized by these 7 states almost immediately when they passed their ordinances of secession, including a number of forts and including even the U.S. Mint in New Orleans, which became one of the early sources of financing for the Confederate States. He doesn't mention what he's going to do about it. He does talk, as we'll see, about what he's going to do about the remaining federal property, which consisted for the most part of 2 key offshore forts, Fort Sumter off Charleston, South Carolina, and Fort Pickens off of Pensacola, Florida. Well, you may wonder, if Lincoln doesn't talk about any of that, what occupies him for 35 minutes? What does he say? And why would I tell you, other than the fact that I study speeches for a living, why would I tell you that this is a significant speech that's worthy of our continued attention? Well, let's look at some of the elements of the text. It's too long to read in its entirety, but I have reproduced for you a number of excerpts from the text. They should be on your table near your place. If you don't have one, hopefully there's one close by. I want to begin with Lincoln's analysis of the cause of the current trouble. Now, by way of comparison, remember that in the second inaugural, looking back, Lincoln will say that the interest constituted by slavery was somehow the cause of the war, and what's more, that everybody knew that. So 4 years later, retrospectively, he's going to say everybody knew that the interest constituted by slavery was somehow the cause of the war. Of course, the war hasn't yet broken out, but he does refer to the current crisis, but look at what he says is the cause. Excerpt 1. Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states. Let me stop there for a second. The cause is apprehension. It's worry on the part of the people of the southern states. What are they worried about, says Lincoln? That by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are to be endangered. In other words, he says they're worried that a Republican administration is going to interfere with their institution of slavery, with their personal security, their personal property, that it's going to interfere with slavery where it already exists. This apprehension is claimed to be unwarranted. He says there has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. So it's unreasonable. It's unreasonable. And there follow a series of reasons why it is unreasonable. And I give you the hint of the first one here. The most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you. And Lincoln then does something that's pretty unusual. It's not unusual for him to avoid a personal reference. This him who now addresses you is not atypical. But what is atypical is that he then proceeds to quote from one of his own speeches in order to prove that he has long been saying that he has no power and no inclination to interfere with slavery. He then says the Republican platform on which he ran and which he's pledged to pledges that it won't interfere with slavery. He then goes on to add a pledge to enforce all the laws, even, he specifically says, the Fugitive Slave Act, which is legal as much as any other law is legal. He does have a caveat. He says you need to be clear, need to be sure that the enforcement of this act will not enslave those who are actually free. Now, if the Southern apprehension is unwarranted and unreasonable, then its expression and its articulation is hyperbolic rhetoric that we ought not take seriously. Now, this early on, you see, positions what Lincoln believes to be causing the trouble as unwarranted, unreasonable, irrational, and his response will follow somewhat from that. Now, it's worth taking just a second to ask ourselves, did Lincoln correctly state what the Southerners were apprehensive about? For some, probably yes, but it was widely recognized at the time that the federal government lacked power to interfere with slavery in the states where it already existed. The threat that Lincoln posed was that by keeping slavery out of new territories and the states to be formed from those territories, eventually there would be a sufficient number of free states that the Constitution could be amended to outlaw slavery. And they believed, as Lincoln himself believed, that slavery must either expand or it eventually will die. So many of them read him correctly and had good reason to be apprehensive, except perhaps in their overestimation of how much could be accomplished within a single presidential term. But it's to Lincoln's great advantage to define their apprehension as being apprehension that their own institutions are about to be interfered with. Now, I said that Lincoln doesn't acknowledge the legitimacy of secession or the fact of secession, but he does talk quite a bit in the speech about the theory of secession. In fact, there are 3 separate places in the speech in which he makes reference to it. And the first of them comes next, and it's a historical and theoretical argument. In excerpt 2, you see the beginning of that. He says, I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual. Why? Well, first, perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments. It is safe to assert that no government proper ever had a provision in its organic law for its own termination. So nobody plans for their own dissolution. Second, he says, many people in the South have talked about the relationship among the states as one of contract. And that goes back to the ratification of the Constitution. So, putting on his lawyer's hat, he says, well, what about a contract? Look at excerpt 3. Again, if the United States be not a government proper, but an association of states in the nature of contract merely. Notice, by the way, that his language trivializes the position that he's going to respond to when he says a contract merely, and that's cast in opposition to a government proper. Nevertheless, he says, can it as a contract be peaceably unmade by less than all the parties who made it? So you can't undo a contract except by the consent of all the parties to the contract. He says, one party may violate it, break it, so to speak, but does it not require all to lawfully rescind it? Now, this is a slightly indirect response to the argument that secession was a perfectly legal act, and therefore one to which any kind of forcible response would be utterly inappropriate. And the justification for secession as a legal act rested on this theory that the Constitution was a contract made among sovereign states, any of whom could back out of the contract. What Lincoln does is to redefine backing out, as the Southerners would see it, as breaking or violating the contract, and he contrasts that with a legal undoing of the contract, which can only be done by all who have made it. So now he's not only said the cause of this is unwarranted apprehension, but what's taking place is no legal act whatsoever, but a violation of what you're claiming in the South to be a contract or a compact or a sacred pledge. Then he goes on to say, you shouldn't be relying on the Constitution anyway, because the Union is older than the Constitution. You can't say the states were fully sovereign at the time of the constitutional ratification, because back in 1774, they had adopted Articles of Association, which Lincoln claims to be the beginning of the Union. And then he says, look at the Constitution if you want to go to the Constitution. What does the preamble of the Constitution say? It says, we the people, and so on and so forth, in order to form a more perfect union. But, he says, if you listen to those who would secede, they would make the union less perfect, because it would no longer have the element of perpetuity to it, and therefore their actions cannot be considered constitutional. Now, what does he conclude from this line of argument? You could imagine all the parts of this argument being put together by somebody who would reach the conclusion, therefore, what the people in these 7 states have done is clearly illegal and must be put down with force. But not Lincoln. In the Inaugural, he draws the conclusion from this block of arguments, therefore, that the acts of secession are null and void. They don't mean anything. Look at excerpt 4. It follows from these views that no state upon its mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union, that resolves and ordinances to that effect are legally void. Now, if they're null and void, he can ignore them because they don't happen. They don't mean anything because they can't. Well, if that's the case, what about the acts of violence that have taken place? Well, he reinterprets those by saying, still in excerpt 4, that acts of violence within any state or states against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary, depending on circumstances. In an earlier draft, instead of the word revolutionary, he had treasonable. But he substituted revolutionary, I think, because it enabled him to maintain that there is a right to revolution, as he had consistently argued. Well, then what are the circumstances that determine whether the acts of violence are insurrectionary or revolutionary? Whether or not they succeed. And Lincoln is segueing into what he will claim to be not only the right but the responsibility of the federal government to try to prevent insurrection. He says, I therefore consider that in view of the Constitution and the laws, the Union is unbroken, and to the extent of my ability, I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the states. Sounds pretty clear. But wait. This is his transition to what his policy is going to be. And he prefaces it by saying, at the beginning of excerpt 5, in doing this, there needs to be no bloodshed or violence, and there shall be none, unless it be forced upon the national authority. Notice carefully that unless clause. If it is forced upon the national authority, there may need to be, and there maybe will be, bloodshed and violence. This is a hint of where he's going to go in this paragraph. Now he says, the power confided to me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government and to collect the duties and imposts. Hold, occupy, and possess. There is one key word missing. And that's the change I was alluding to before that was recommended by Orville Browning, and that is the word reclaim. Lincoln does not say that he is going to take back the forts and property that have already been seized. He says he's going to hold, occupy, and possess. Does this mean that Lincoln was, in contemporary language, a wimp about his intentions? I think not. Browning's argument was that to say that Lincoln would reclaim the forts would be provocative. If Lincoln were to seek to reclaim the forts, who would be acting first? Well, you could say those who seized the forts, but it would look like the federal government would be acting first. And that would be an invasion. That would constitute aggression. That might tilt the balance, the precarious balance in the 8 slave states that have not yet seceded. So Lincoln took the phrase out, not because I think he didn't plan to reclaim the forts, but because I think he had decided by this time that an attempt would be made to prevent him from holding the remaining forts. That would position the seceding states as the aggressor, the federal government acting in self-defense, and it would then be justified to go after the forts that had been earlier taken. Collect the duties and imposts. That, of course, can be done offshore without directly confronting the recalcitrant southern states. But now let's stop for a minute beyond these specifics in the text and think about what Lincoln could have said here if he's going to announce his policy. There are all kinds of places where he could have drawn a line in this speech between what he's willing to put up with and what he's not willing to put up with. He could have drawn the line at secession itself, clearly an illegal act, but he doesn't. He could have drawn the line at the seizure of federal property, but insofar as that already happened, he doesn't. He could have drawn the line at interference with the collection of tariff duties. That's illegal, but he doesn't. He says we'll continue to collect them because we can do it offshore. Now, if you look further in Excerpt 5, he says, where hostility to the United States in any interior locality shall be so great and so universal as to prevent competent resident citizens from holding the federal offices, there will be no attempt to force obnoxious strangers among the people for that object. Now look, he could have said, you're going to interfere with my ability to appoint federal office holders to carry out the law. That's insurrectionary. I'm going to put that down. But he doesn't. Look at the beginning of the paragraph that I end this excerpt with. The mails, unless repelled, will continue to be furnished in all parts of the Union. Interference with the U.S. mail is a federal offense. He could have drawn the line there, but he doesn't. He says the mails will be delivered unless repelled. So where does he draw the line? Well, look back up in that same excerpt at the part that I skipped over, where he talks about hold, occupy, and possess the property in places. And look what follows the semicolon. But beyond what may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere. Now look what he's done. We found two places in the speech where he's indicated where he's willing to use force. And they're both in negative clauses. One starts with unless, one starts with but, and in those clauses he says where he won't use force, but he marks out these exceptions where he might. Now that's a rather indirect, and you could argue conciliatory way to state what he is going to do. But it does make pretty clear where Lincoln chooses to draw the line. And the effect of drawing the line at this place should be obvious to us, and that is it positions the South. It positions the seceding states as the aggressor in the event of war. And I think by this time Lincoln has come to the conclusion that war is unavoidable. He positions the South as the aggressor for the sake perhaps of appealing to moderates in the North, saying, I've done everything I can to prevent this, it's been forced upon me. We always regard our wars as wars of self-defense, and perhaps in order to appeal to other nations to forego, at least for a while, recognition of the Confederacy. So Lincoln has defined the cause, concluded that secession is null and void, stated what his policy is. He then introduces his second argument against secession. And he begins with a plea that I've captured in Excerpt 6, saying, before entering upon so grave a matter as the destruction of our national fabric, with all its benefits, its memories, and its hopes, would it not be wise to ascertain precisely why we do it? This is one of several places in the speech where Lincoln says, in effect, slow down, take time. Don't race to an unknown future without being clear about why you're doing it. Hold on to the present. and with the present hold on to the heritage of the past. In several of his speeches, Lincoln manipulates a sense of time and timing. So in the second inaugural, for example, you go from past to present to future. In the Gettysburg Address, you do the same thing, and you see the future as a kind of culmination. Here he's doing the opposite. He's warning people off of going too quickly to the future without thinking very carefully about what they're about to do. And he says, will you hazard so desperate a step while there's any possibility that a portion of the ills you fly from have no real existence? How could he say the ills they fly from have no real existence? Because he said earlier that their apprehension is unreasonable and unwarranted and hyperbolic. So he says, pull back, consider the possibility that you're concerned about something that, after all, is imaginary. Will you, while the certain ills you fly to are greater than all the real ones you fly from, will you risk the commission of so fearful a mistake? And then he says, indirectly, what you're trying to do might be justified if a right plainly guaranteed in the Constitution had been denied to you. But he says specifically, that's not the case. He says the dispute involves not rights plainly guaranteed in the Constitution, but matters of interpretation about what is not expressly stated in the constitutional text. How do we deal with such matters? He says, we have to deal with them by majority rule. Because if the majority capitulates to the minority, that is despotism. That's not the will of the people. And if the minority is able to threaten to secede when it doesn't get its way, that is anarchy. Because if you allow that, then a minority of that minority is equally justified in seceding from the original minority when it doesn't get its way, and so on and so forth in an infinite regress that leads to anarchy. And in excerpt 7, I capture that idea. The central idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. Now that, of course, is not how the seceding states consider what they're doing, but Lincoln defines it that way, repositions it as anarchy, and argues why he says that's the case, and concludes, therefore, that the majority must rule. This is not a big threat because a majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations and always changing easily with deliberate change in public opinions and sentiments is the only true sovereign of a free people. He considers the argument that the Supreme Court should have the final say, and here he's walking on a very delicate ground because Lincoln has opposed the Dred Scott decision, and his political opponents claimed that he was attacking the authority of the Supreme Court. And so here Lincoln explains that, of course, the Supreme Court rules in particular cases concerning individuals who bring their cases before it, but if we extract from those decisions a broad political rule, then the people shall have ceased to govern themselves. This is an earlier view of the Supreme Court from the one that most people hold today, but it reflects the fact that the Dred Scott decision was only the second time that the Supreme Court had declared an act of Congress unconstitutional, and arguably only the first time in a substantive dispute. Then Lincoln proceeds to the third argument against secession, beginning with the claim that I made earlier. One section says slavery's right, and that's the only substantial dispute between us. Seems to me Lincoln says that's the only substantial dispute, not in order to magnify it, but to minimize it. Just like he said in one of the letters, it's no cause for anger. And so he develops a kind of argument that we call a reductio ad absurdum, that is, reducing a proposition to absurdity in order to argue that it's wrong. And he says, physically speaking, we cannot separate. Now, what he means by that is you can't do what Barry Goldwater proposed in 1964 when he said we should saw off the eastern seaboard and let it float out to sea. Physically, we can't separate. Well, of course we can't. We're on the continent together, the same rivers are there, Kentucky and Ohio are adjacent one way or another, and so on and so forth. But from the conclusion that we physically cannot separate, or from the statement we physically cannot separate, he reaches the conclusion, therefore, that only one national family can occupy this land. He does say, however, that the rights retained by the people, while they don't include lawful secession, they do retain very clear rights, and he says in Excerpt 9, whenever they grow weary of the existing government, they can exercise their constitutional right of amending it or their revolutionary right to dismember or overthrow it. Now, this again is positioning what the South is doing as attempted revolution, not as lawful act. Lincoln goes on to say he much prefers the amendment route, and he knows that there are a number of amendments being talked about, and he's not going to comment about any of them with one exception. He says he knows that there's an amendment that has been proposed. In fact, it just passed the Congress the morning of the inaugural address, right before Congress adjourned, that would permanently, unamendably guarantee that the federal government would not interfere with slavery in the states where it then existed. And as Dr. Schwartz pointed out, ironically, that would have been the 13th Amendment had it been ratified. It had just gone out to the states for ratification, and Lincoln specifically says in the inaugural he would not oppose that. Now, in some respects, this is a gratuitous comment because the president doesn't have to approve constitutional amendments when they go out from the Congress, but he says he would not oppose that. Now, when we think of Lincoln as the great emancipator, we may wonder why he would not oppose that, and his reason was simple. He thought it merely made explicit what was already implicit and well understood, that the federal government had no power to interfere with slavery in the states where it existed. In fact, as you know, when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he claimed the power only as a subsidiary of his war powers as president. Now we get close to the end of the speech, and Lincoln once again appeals for patience. Excerpt 10, why should there not be a patient confidence in the ultimate justice of the people? And he goes on to say in Excerpt 10 that if slavery is right, then the South, by God's will prevail and convince others of that. If slavery is wrong, the North will prevail and convince others of that. And the answer, justice will surely prevail by the judgment of this great tribunal, the American people. And then he says, look, people give power to the government for a limited time. How much damage can I do in 4 years? Now, he could have gone on to say, which he didn't, his party didn't have control of the Congress. They didn't gain the control of the Congress except insofar as Southerners resigned and withdrew. So people give limited power for a limited time, so calm down and carry on, as they said in Britain in World War II. And he appeals in Excerpt 11, saying there's no need to hurry. Think calmly and well upon this whole subject. Nothing valuable can be lost by taking time. If there be an object to hurry any of you into hot haste to a step you would never take deliberately, that object will be frustrated by taking time, but no good object can be frustrated by it. And then in the conclusion, he very specifically fixes the locus of responsibility. And look what he says. He says in Excerpt 12, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. Notice the reference to my dissatisfied fellow countrymen. Did the supporters of secession think of themselves as any longer his fellow countrymen? Of course not. But this is part and parcel of his refusal to acknowledge that secession is legitimate. So he addresses them as his fellow countrymen who are satisfied and says to them whether there will be civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. Now, this is the natural result of the way he has defined the conflict and positioned the South earlier in the address. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. And then following this is the famous peroration that Seward suggested and that Lincoln rewrote to make it more elegant. I am loath to close. That paragraph replaced Lincoln's earlier text in which he said, with you and not with me is the solemn question of, shall it be peace or a sword? That was to be the ending line of the speech, but instead there is this beautiful and elegant evocation of our common bonds, our common tradition, and our common heritage. The speech was polarizing. It was widely interpreted in the North as conciliatory, widely interpreted in the South, not just in the states that had seceded, as quite otherwise. A New Orleans newspaper said, we are told that if we only submit to these doctrines, Lincoln will make the greatest president we have ever had, and he's quite moderate and all of that. Will you come into my parlor, said the spider to the fly. Lincoln's hope for time was thwarted. The very next day, he received word from Major Anderson at Fort Sumter that provisions would run out. He attempted to resupply the fort with food only, notified the governor of South Carolina that that's what he would do. But under General P.G.T. Beauregard, Fort Sumter was attacked before it could be supplied, and the war came. But the positions of the two sides, attack versus defense, and the goals at stake, emerged as they did, largely as the result of Lincoln's successful definition of the situation in the inaugural address. The war for emancipation would come about later, largely as a result of the circumstances of the war itself. Thank you very much. The founders were not all of one mind, as we all know. The Constitution itself was a product of compromises, including the fact that the Constitution permitted the continuation of slavery and didn't interfere with the slave trade for 20 years and so on. In the Cooper Union speech, Lincoln went through the views of the signers of the Declaration and of the Constitution on the question of the power of the federal government to prevent the extension of slavery, and argued there that he was in line with a clear majority of them. And I think that's probably true with respect to secession as well.
My name is Randy Williams. The words are beautiful and have been recognized as such. As a student of speech, is there any evidence of how he actually sounded? What was the timbre of his voice? What was his accent?
There's a little bit. As you can imagine, it's fragmentary because there weren't sound recordings. So the evidence is in things that people who heard him wrote about him. And he had a high-pitched voice. It was nasal. He had a Kentucky twang. He did not always pause in the places where you would imagine that he would, and so on. But he had an ability to project his voice a considerable distance. I suspect if we heard him on television today, we'd be surprised by his voice.
My name is Tom Carson. I wonder what you think would have happened if the South hadn't attacked first, if they hadn't fired the first shot.
You know, there's a whole branch of counterfactual history of which there are loads of questions about this in the Civil War. I mean, I digress for a second before I respond to you, but one of the questions that I'm particularly interested in is what would have happened if the nominating conventions in 1860 had been held in the other order? If the Republicans hadn't known that the Democrats were going to split, would they have nominated Seward, and so on and so forth. But your question says, what would have happened if the South had not fired the first shot? I think there probably would have been a fairly lengthy standoff in which Fort Sumter would have been resupplied with food. There would have been no military action taken, and Lincoln at least would have tried to continue the effort to win the support of public opinion, certainly in the states that had not yet seceded, and to whatever degree he thought he could in the states that had. And what the ultimate outcome would have been of that, I really don't know. My inclination is to say war probably would have come about, if not on April the 12th, at some other time over some similar kind of situation, because I think that's an inherently unstable standoff. And as I said, my own view is that Lincoln himself had reached that conclusion, that the tug would indeed have to come, and that's why he was so concerned about positioning the federal government on the defensive.
Another question over here.
Rebecca Deeds, Riverside Brookfield High School. I was wondering how Lincoln's inaugural address was viewed by England.
How his inaugural address was what? I'm sorry.
Perceived by England?
How his inaugural address was perceived by England. I have not studied that very much. I suspect that opinion was divided. English opinion was divided in part because there was an economic tie between England and the Confederacy because of the cotton trade, and England did not really sway pretty strongly in a unionist direction until the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. So my guess would be that it was divided.
Mike Miller from Chicago, and I wanted to ask you, Doctor, you stated that Lincoln considered secession an impossibility. It didn't exist.
A legal impossibility.
A legal impossibility. In some of his earlier speeches and writings, the Confederates, of course, as you stated, didn't view it that way. The Confederates were aligning themselves with the Patriots from 1776, and that they were acting in a revolutionary type way. What did Lincoln think of the right of revolution?
Well, I'm going to answer your question, but first I have to take issue with one of the things you said. When you said the Confederates viewed themselves in a revolutionary way. Some did, and some believed that they were exercising a purely lawful right granted to them under the Constitution. Now, what Lincoln is doing, I think, in this address, is trying to eliminate the latter position, so that the Southerners would need to claim that they were engaged in revolution. Now, Lincoln's views on the right to revolution were quite clear, and they were set out, I think, most explicitly in the speech that he gave as a congressman opposing the Mexican War, in which he explicitly defended the right to revolution. And in this inaugural, he defends the right to revolution that the people possess. Now, what he doesn't defend is that because some of the Southerners say they are revolutionary, they are. Remember, he says it's either insurrectionary or revolutionary depending on circumstances. And what are the circumstances in this case? He says we have a constitution, we have free elections, you can change the government by amending the Constitution, you can change the people who occupy the government in regular elections. Therefore, given the existence of this constitutional framework, there's no justification for revolution, and it's therefore appropriate to view what's taking place as insurrection, which the federal government then has not only the right but the duty to put down.
Question. My name's Leo DeHone. This is actually just a comment on the question about what the Founding Fathers thought about secession. I know that Alexander Hamilton, in several instances, said that governments don't sow the seeds of their own destruction. So I would infer that that means that the government can't dissolve itself. So Lincoln was on firm ground with the founding fathers.
Yes, and he says in the text of the speech that no organic act contains the seeds of its own destruction. So, I mean, Lincoln very clearly believed that he was on the ground occupied by the founding fathers, and that was consistent with what he believed ever since Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zarefsky.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.